It's Dr. Sabrina Siegel here with a special series brought to you by the NEI Podcast. Welcome to the PsychopharmaStahlogy Show. In this special series, Dr. Andrew Cutler interviews Dr. Stephen Stahl on the most controversial, novel, and exciting topics in psychopharmacology today. Every 3 months, we will address a different theme in psychopharmacology. Each theme is split into 3 parts, with 1 part released each month. This next theme is on the future of psychopharmacology. This theme focuses on the updated 5th edition of Stahl's Essential Psychopharmacology, the 5E video series, effective strategies for learning about psychopharmacology, and what's on the horizon for the field. Let's listen in to part 1, What's New in the 5th edition of Stahl's Essential Psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the Psychopharmacology Show. I'm Dr. Andy Cutler, and I'm here, as always, with my mentor, Dr. Stephen Stahl. Steve, we've got some interesting things we're going to be talking about here. We've got a 3-part series working around the fact that you've updated your textbook. This is now the 5th edition of Stahl's Essential Psychopharmacology.
Right, and the focus really is, why does anybody need an update? What's happened in this field since, in my case, 2000 and 2013, when the last one was written, so that's about 8 years.
You've been slacking for 8 years, Steve. Come on.
I know, I was going to update it at 5, and it never happened. I don't know.
It seems like every day you wait, more is happening, so at some point you just got to dive in there. But you're right, this is not necessarily talking about the book, the 5th edition, as much as it is what's going on in the field that would necessitate a new edition, right?
Exactly. Okay.
Well, let's dive in and talk about some of the biggest changes that were made. What are some of these changes that needed to be made for the 5th edition?
Well, the biggest one is just an update on whatever were the major things happening in the field. It's fun to look back and compare, in my case, something that happened 8 years ago and today and see what the changes were. The biggest ones probably are in the number of drugs that came in and some of the ways in which we look at certain illnesses. And it's very interesting to see how the big advances have occurred, like in psychosis and to a certain extent mood, but not so much in substance abuse treatment or anxiety, for example, or even in ADHD. So, the innovation pace is different and asymmetric. And so we updated what there were. And there's a cosmetic change that we did in that Nancy Muntner, who's my longtime illustrator. By the way, this is now 25 years since we started this darn book series.
My goodness.
So we decided to refresh the icons and make them, all the figures, look a little bit more like some kind of icon you would see on your iPhone or for your apps and so forth. They were refreshed and modernized, and every figure in the book was actually changed. So we didn't want it to look stale, and we have a different style. It's subtle, but colors were, changed and so forth to modernize it. So it was time to do that after 25 years. And about half the figures were entirely new, but the other half were all changed.
Wow, that's incredible. So even people who have seen the previous editions would find this visually different.
I have an ongoing kind of funny debate with Nancy about this. And I say, they really read this book for the words. And she rolls her eyes and said, Stahl, they look at this book because of the pictures. I'm sorry to tell you. And I fear that she's right.
That's actually part of the learning process, though, isn't it? What you recommend is actually to go through first and look at the figures and read the captions and then go back and read.
Yeah, that's the one thing that didn't change really between the 2 editions, or actually over the whole 5 editions. It's called programmed learning. If you study how adults learn, they tend to learn in ways that are not really well represented by lecture courses all the time or by books. They learn in small multiples. Well, people don't sit down for 6 hours, and they sit down for 20 minutes, maybe to an hour. And so the way you present the material is in a meal. You have an hors d'oeuvre to whet the appetite. You actually serve bite-sized portions, and then if you're lucky, you get a nice dessert to top it off. And then you repeat it and repeat it, but it's boring to repeat it the same way. So in this case, I've always said, read the figures, because in this case, all the figures cover all the text. So if you just look at the pictures the first time through a chapter, maybe reading the captions, Then you have the first iteration through it. Then read the chapter. And the funny thing that happens after you've done that is that the next time you want to review the material, it'll come rapidly back in your brain just by looking at the pictures again. So it's very smart. So you're going to read the mood once, and then later, weeks or even months later, just look at the pictures again, and it'll all come back. And so that is the case. We'll talk in another podcast about trying to maximize this further by even having a set of lectures on these slides available in a video series. But whatever it is, we're trying to do program learning, assist the person that's learning this. We know you have to repeat it in order to understand it, but it should be a delightful way to repeat, not an onerous way to repeat.
Learning should be fun, right? That's definitely one of the principles of adult learning. It should be fun. Should be some humor. One of the things you mentioned that didn't occur to me is 2013 was also the year that DSM-5 came out. So really, you're also updating your book to be more in congruity, if you will, with DSM-5.
That's true. And that was a big change. And of course, it affected some of the syndromes more than others. But yeah, that only happens about every 30 years.
It seems like. Well, for instance, OCD and PTSD both are no longer considered anxiety disorders. They've moved into their own categories.
That's also reflected in this version, because in the old version, we had it under the anxiety disorders, and OCD is going into a chapter on impulsivity and compulsivity, which actually also is related to drug abuse, which is in that chapter. And PTSD is now considered its own kind of disorder, like a trauma-related section.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's really interesting. I remember you often saying, though, DSM-5 will be the last version of DSM we'll ever see. And I think part of it is because of the fact that it's just, despite everybody's attempts, it's just not that neurobiologically informed. It's just a bunch of experts coming together and coming up with syndromes.
Yes, but they're high upon a hill in a retreat someplace, probably castle. And then they choose a pope and they choose a new disorder. The color of the smoke that comes out, we watch hopelessly in the valley here to see, did they come up with a new disorder or not? And if the right color smoke comes out, we know we have a new one.
Exactly. Well, talking about not only the nosology and the diagnoses, let's talk a little bit about the treatments. I understand that, and this was really interesting to me to look at, there have been 14 drugs that have new uses to them. That's really incredible since the last time your book came out.
Right. And that's the history of CNS, is that the first indication is rarely the only indication. And it's true that there are 14 drugs have new uses and indications. And actually in this book, in the last 8 years, there's 18 brand new drugs that have come out.
18 drugs have been approved since 2013. That's remarkable.
People have said that this has been a bad time for CNS. Many of the big pharma companies have pulled out of innovation. And actually, it's a kind of a sea change occurred between these years between the two editions. Pharma is back, but it's little pharma. So little pharma is doing all sorts of innovative stuff. Yeah. And even I've seen some of the big pharmas are retooling in CNS.
That's right.
So I think this could be considered the beginning of the third generation. The first generation maybe being in the 60s when the very first drugs in psychopharm came out, the original antidepressants and antipsychotics and anxiolytics. And then it pooped out in the 80s. And then in the 90s, it took off again with all the SSRIs and atypicals. And then it pooped out again, say in the first decade of the 21st century. And now it's taken off again. So watch out. There's going to be a lot of new stuff. We're going to have actually a complete podcast in this series about what's the future of psychopharm, looking into the crystal ball with this third generation of new innovations coming forward.
No, I absolutely agree. I started my career, and part of my excitement in getting into this was the beginning of that second generation with the SSRIs, SNRIs, and the atypicals. But yet, for the past 70 years, really, the 1950 was Thorazine, we've just been manipulating monoamines. And so now we're really on the cusp of whole new mechanisms of action and new neurotransmitter systems. And certainly that's reflected in this book.
Right. So I say, hold on to your seat. Because, wow, we're going to glutamate, particularly NMDA mechanisms, and new GABA mechanisms that work on receptors that benzodiazepines don't work on, and even orexin and stuff like that. And God only knows what's going to be behind that. So we have lots of things. In fact, glutamate has a whole bunch of receptors, and we only really are talking about one of the receptors. So I think that the future is quite rich. We have new targets.
Yeah, I certainly agree. And some of this, I did a podcast with Roger McIntyre recently. We were talking about this, how a lot of the innovation now parallels the technological advances that allow us to understand the neurobiology better than ever.
Well, I got bad news for anybody listening, and that is I don't treat major depressive disorder, and neither should they, and I don't think they do. I don't treat schizophrenia, and neither should they, and I don't think they do. I treat delusions. I treat hallucinations. I treat sadness and insomnia and problems concentrating. We treat symptoms. And actually, that's one of the reflections that we have in each of the chapters is the symptoms and circuits. How do you deconstruct the syndrome of psychosis into its components? And in doing that, for example, in psychosis, we need to target the stuff that doesn't work. In other words, we certainly are going to have new, and we should maybe mention those, ways to treat the positive symptoms of psychosis, but there's huge unmet needs for the cognitive and negative symptoms of psychosis, which are in different circuits and obviously need different neurotransmitters and blocking dopamine. Yeah. And so that's the way forward, is to look at what's the unmet need of the things we can't treat.
Yeah, you're really talking about a paradigm shift here. Certainly in my early training, we used to talk about parts of the brain that weren't functioning properly. It's so much more now about circuits and regulation of things.
The brain is topographically organized. That means that the duty of one circuit is different than another. So if you have inefficient information processing in a certain circuit, you might have problems concentrating. That's all that circuit does. And another circuit, though, is responsible for guilt or for hallucinations. And we've actually gone through some of the hypothetical circuits, and we probably don't have them because the details are changing all the time. But the concept is still very solid, which is that in psychiatry, we treat symptoms. In fact, how many disorders there are in DSM?
I don't offhand.
Well, I think it's in the 250 range, 253 or something like that. So I had one of our people, Megan Grady, look for a possible book to do. And I said, how many symptoms are there in DSM? Because, my God, each of those syndromes has 3 to 10 symptoms. I thought, God, I wonder how many. If there's 253 disorders, how many symptoms must there be? And you know what the answer is?
Thousands.
79.
Oh, my. I am so wrong.
I was so wrong.
They overlap.
Exactly. Yeah. And so that's the whole point. The brain only can get its distress out a certain number of ways, and there's a finite number of symptoms. Now, we put them together in different constellations, but you have problems concentrating in ADHD, you got problems concentrating in depression, you got problems concentrating in GAD. It's problems concentrating. Concentrating in narcolepsy in people who don't sleep. So the same circuit doesn't work, and the same neurotransmitters can fix that circuit. So the same treatments can cut across numerous disorders, and that's the future.
Exactly.
And so we try to actually deconstruct in each of the chapters to the extent is known. And again, this will probably look foolish in retrospect in a decade because we'll learn more about it. But the concept is a certain circuit has a certain responsibility. And then what we're doing with our treatments is to fix that by either blocking or stimulating, in this case, mostly monoamines. We're soon to have more. And the other thing is that since each of our patients has problems in more than one circuit, because they don't come in with one symptom, it may be that some of the neurotransmitters are different for symptom A than for symptoms B. Sometimes I joke and say, well, if God commits polypharmacy in the normal functioning of the brain, maybe we should too. And so that could give us what we all know is that combinations of drugs really work better in particularly complex in patients that don't get better with one first-line treatment to add neurotransmitters together.
Yeah. And of the 250-something syndromes described in DSM, there's only a small percentage that have treatments that are FDA approved for them. So there's huge unmet need.
Exactly. And where a whole lot of those are in the DSM that aren't treatable are in the substance abuse category. Now, you could say there is some treatment in general. We do cover that, but nobody uses them. There's 2% of people with smoking cessation needs, with alcoholism needs, with opioid needs, get the treatments that are available. Sure. So either they don't work, or we don't believe in them, or it's not even clear what the barriers are. But one of the things that's interesting is that the neurobiology of preclinical animal studies is beginning to show all sorts of promise with new neurotransmitters, even some of the glutamate, the metabotropic mGluR receptors in animals. And that's good because it turns out that an addicted rat or an alcoholic rat is much closer to an alcoholic human than is a schizophrenic rat, which there isn't really anything. Yeah. And so the models are translationally neurobiologically robust. In other words, if you can fix an alcoholism in a rat, there's a real good chance you can do it in a human. So there's an explosion of interest in substance abuse. I hope that in the next book, or at least in the next decade, the next 2 books, we have a explosion of treatments for substance abuse. Yeah, what a horrible group of illnesses. What a group of malignant psychiatric disorders, death, disability, and little or no treatment.
We know there's a huge epidemic, and certainly it's been made worse during the time of COVID. The incidence of opioid abuse, for instance, and methamphetamine use and unintentional overdoses has skyrocketed. It's really remarkable.
Yes, and it's like the form of these darn circuits again.
Yep.
Circuits are plastic, and they change, and they learn. And so when you're addicted, you have learned to have certain behaviors, and it's almost involuntary. You become a little bit like a Pavlovian dog. And we cover that too in the new drug abuse chapter, which is that if you go to a place where you've abused your opioid before, or you even just see a syringe, the dopamine in your brain goes up when you get the opium the first time you take opium, okay? But once you're addicted, it goes up as soon as you see the little baggie, as soon as you touch the crack pipe. You don't have anything in your body, but the dopamine is already going up. And it's an involuntary reflex, a little bit, again, like you ring a bell in the mouth waters for a Pavlovian dog. And to reverse that is going to take more than just blocking the reward of these drugs. So that's the future, but the present is that we should use the medication-assisted treatments that are available better, and we don't.
Certainly. Along the lines of that, people are starting to look more into hedonia. They're starting to look at it as a more sophisticated concept than just pleasure. And so, for instance, dopamine seems to be more associated with the anticipatory hedonia, the wanting phase, and opioids are actually more associated with the liking phase or the consummatory hedonia.
So when people think about having a podcast with you and me, their dopamine goes up. But when they have it, their endorphins go up, right?
That's exactly it, 100%. Now, speaking of this, talking about circuits and treating across symptoms, across diagnoses, one of the biggest things you've done, which is a little bit bold here, I think, is you've changed the nomenclature. And drugs you're now naming for mechanism of action as opposed to simply the categories of antidepressant or antipsychotic, which can cause a big problem clinically when you want to give a patient an antipsychotic for a mood disorder, for instance.
Yes, I think this is a very good trend. I'm on a committee of a lot of different organizations that are putting together, it's called neuroscience-based nomenclature, which means that we name drugs for their biological, pharmacological mechanism of action like they do in every other branch of medicine. Talking about antidepressants is very interesting because it now looks like over half of the people with a major depressive episode don't get a monoamine reuptake blocking antidepressant. Why? Because they have bipolar depression or they've got depression with mixed features. So they get treated for their depression, but not with a, quote, antidepressant. So it's quite misleading. And then, of course, antipsychotics are used for depression. Go figure. I'll tell you a secret here, Andy, and that is that when I wrote this book, I had to do a word check and try to take the word antipsychotic and antidepressant out. Oh my God, was that
hard? It is hard.
Antidepressant drug, and there's antidepressant actions.
Exactly.
Or antidepressant actions, but really we don't want to talk about antidepressant drugs. We want to talk about monoamine reuptake inhibitors or serotonin dopamine antagonists that work for depression. So have you ever, people listening here, gone to a doctor or been the doctor and said, oh, we're going to give you this medicine for your depression. What is it, doctor? It's an antipsychotic. What? You're telling me I'm that sick? I'm crazy? I'm psychotic? I'm not taking that. Very upsetting.
Exactly. No, it's a huge problem. And the body doesn't know that this drug is supposed to just do one thing. It's affecting chemicals, as you said.
Right. And these drugs, particularly the old-fashioned antipsychotics, have a whole bunch of pharmacological mechanisms. Yeah. And at high doses, they block D2 receptors and work to reduce positive symptoms. But at moderate doses, they have these other pharmacological properties that work to help depression. And there's at least 4 and soon to be 5 approved drugs that are originally came on the market for schizophrenia that are going onto the market for bipolar depression.
Exactly. Yeah, that's true. And I like this idea of higher and lower doses. They do different things. The higher dose antipsychotic, antimanic, lower dose maybe the antidepressant. But what's also interesting is all the drugs in this category seem to be effective at treating psychosis, especially positive symptoms. But they're not all as effective as antidepressants. The antidepressant action is not equally distributed across the class.
Well, those secondary properties are different. And so they all have D2 antagonist properties, so that's how they're alike. Again, it reminds me of that old story about Yogi Berra, the famous New York Yankee catcher of the 1950s and 60s. And he was once asked by a reporter, "Hey, Yogi, you got a son. How are you alike?" And he scratched his head and thought for a minute, we are alike, but our similarities are different.
I was hoping you'd tell that story. I was waiting for that exact story.
The antipsychotics are similar and then they have D2 antagonists, but all the other properties are different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's certainly true. And I am thinking about other fields of medicine where you have an ACE inhibitor or a calcium channel blocker or something like that, or even named for the chemical structure, a penicillin or something like that. But there are broad categories. There's antibiotics and antihypertensives, but that's not how you specifically refer to them.
But yeah, you just said it. It's a category. It's not a drug. So people don't actually really talk about antibiotics in the sense that when they talk about a specific drug, they have a specific name for it. And we don't do that. What's the difference between olanzapine and lumateperone? They're atypical antipsychotics, which is really what we're trying to get away with. And one of the things we did was purge the 5th edition of the
That's amazing.
Notorious words antipsychotic and antidepressant.
I don't know how you did that. That's quite an accomplishment in and of itself. But I certainly hope the field follows you.
Keeping up with the latest in psychiatry shouldn't be a struggle. SynovianFieldMedical.com is a new website for clinicians where you can find a library of free, hand-selected resources such as videos and infographics on important psychiatry topics. You can request an educational program for your practice or connect with Synovian medical professionals in your area. Synovian wants to help you get all of your psychiatry questions answered. Go to SynovianFieldMedical.com and explore what Synovian has to offer.
We talked also about the change in the understanding of neurobiology and things like that. Let's focus in on a couple of different topics. Let's talk about psychosis first. What's new in the area of psychosis? And I know it's a lot.
Wow, it's huge because we've finally gone beyond dopamine. For 50 or whatever, 70 years, we've known that the dopamine hypothesis was in play. And it's certainly true that there's too much dopamine. You can see it actually on PET scans now in the presynaptic neuron in the mesolimbic system. But the reality is that there are many other things that affect that. So that the primary problem may not be that there's just a dopamine excess. It could be caused by upstream and downstream things, again, by understanding the circuitry. So you've got new ideas with glutamate driving this. You have new ideas with serotonin driving it. And in fact, new treatments based upon that, serotonin 2A antagonists, are actually forms of antipsychotics, particularly in the psychosis of Alzheimer's disease and the psychosis of Parkinson's disease. Right. You even have a cholinergic story. Oh my gosh, that a cholinergic agonist, particularly M4 and maybe M1 agonists, actually are upstream of the dopamine neuron and driving it, just like the
Mm-hmm.
serotonin neuron may be driving the psychosis.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And now you even have things called trace amines, and that trace amines help the presynaptic dopamine neuron determine how much dopamine it's going to make.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you stimulate a trace amine receptor, it turns out that it stops dopamine synthesis. If you want me to get technical, it dimerizes, marries, hugs, whatever you want to call it, dimerizes, heterodimerizes with a D2 receptor, which causes biased agonism, if you want to get technical, which means that it makes sure that when the receptor gets its dopamine, it goes through a certain pathway that shuts down dopamine synthesis. So you don't have to block the dopamine receptor, and you can just stop the dopamine itself from being too high. So there are some very cool things going on, not only in the conceptualization of all the neurotransmitters and the circuits and what those neurotransmitters are. It turns out that if you play on those neurotransmitters with new agents that are not D2 antagonists, you have a drug that has antipsychotic actions. Go figure. Wow, wow, wow.
Yeah. I understand there's also been a revision to the dopamine theory itself as far as what circuit is actually involved with positive symptoms. We used to think it was simply mesolimbic to the ventral striatum, but I understand it's a little more complicated than that.
That's what our PET scanners, people like Oliver Howes in London and Anissa Abhidargam in New York, have told us. And they agree with each other independently. It turns out that the mesolimbic system is really based on rats and rodents. If you look at human striatum, it's more complicated. And it turns out that the sensory motor part of the striatum, which is a little bit more in the middle of the striatum, is the most hyperactive on PET scans. And it turns out that what feeds it is not just the VTA, which we've heard, ventral tegmental area is classical, but I hate to tell you this as a secret, so does the substantia nigra, which we thought only had motor control.
Ooh, I thought that was nigrostriatal only.
Yeah, part of the striatum feeds the sensory motor striatum, part of the VTA does. And so the point would be it's still dopamine, it's still in the striatum, it's just in a little bit different part than would be in a rodent. And it doesn't really change the hypothesis really significantly, except its anatomical localization. What's really interesting is you can stop that dopamine by trace amine stimulation, as I told you. You can stop it upstream with cholinergic and with serotonergic actions right now, and possibly glutamate and others in the future.
Yeah, it certainly is fascinating. It's just almost mind-boggling how much is going on here. And I think very soon we may actually have some of these drugs that you're talking about that affect some of these systems. Some of these drugs are in late development for some of these conditions.
Exactly.
So, for instance, the TAR1 drugs and the muscarinic drugs are actually in fairly late development. They're in phase 3 studies. So we may find out.
I have emphasized in this book mostly the drugs that are on the market, and then at the very end of each chapter, put the relevant drugs that have gone into at least phase 2. And so hopefully they will actually come to the market soon.
Yeah.
Right now, we're stuck pretty much with just drugs that block dopamine for the treatment of schizophrenia. With the use of the 5-HT2A antagonists, particularly pimavanserin is one of them, that is already approved for Parkinson's disease, and looking forward to doing it for the psychosis of dementia.
Yeah, DRP. Another big area of change and evolution and thinking that you made changes to is the chapters on mood disorders. And that includes things like you mentioned earlier, GABA receptors and neurosteroids. And I understand you've moved GABA out of anxiety into the mood disorder section.
Yeah, because that's innovation. And it turns out that there are 2 types of GABA A receptors, and we knew that before, but we really didn't emphasize it. And one of these is benzodiazepine sensitive, and the other one isn't. And so we've been worshiping at the altar of benzodiazepines, and now we think it's blasphemy, if you will, because only people are afraid of giving benzodiazepines because they have problems. But it turns out that there's a class of drugs, as you mentioned earlier, called a neuroactive steroid that acts on this other set of benzodiazepine insensitive GABA A receptors. And if you care, they modulate tonic, in other words, the tone of the synapse, whereas the benzo-sensitive receptors regulate the phasic, or the real firing.
Mm-hmm.
Bottom line, if you treat people with a neuroactive steroids, it actually works at both sets of receptors, where the benzos only act on one.
Mm-hmm.
That neuroactive steroids certainly are already approved for the treatment of postpartum depression, and now have good early studies in major depression.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're talking about brexanolone is on the market, and zuranolone is one that's being studied. There's actually several in development of these drugs working in this way. So it's a very exciting time. There's also other things going on in mood disorders too. Certainly our understanding of neuroinflammation and the inflammatory system. What can you say about that?
It's a hope, but not a reality yet. Certainly, it looks like the brain is on fire in various psychiatric disorders, and some of them that are best studied would be the mood disorders.
Mm-hmm.
How to put that fire out from, if you will, inflammatory actions is still a quandary, because we don't know, particularly pro-inflammatory cytokines are specifically the problem in different disorders and different brain areas. Mm-hmm. And the other things, we don't know how to treat it, because anti-inflammatory agents are generally large molecules that can get into the brain.
Mm-hmm.
So there have been some studies with small molecules that are somewhat anti-inflammatory, even non-steroidal anti-inflammatories and so
mm-hmm.
forth. And they really have been underwhelming in
mm-hmm.
terms of treating psychiatric disorders. But we're going to stay tuned and see if we can't find some of these factors that work in the brain. And it is possible that if you really slow down inflammation outside of the brain, that maybe it'll, if you will, quell it in the brain by proxy, if you will. So there's the hope that you might not even have to get these things into the brain. But it's early days.
Yeah. And we've talked about circuits, and we talked about symptoms within syndromes. One of the areas that's really important is, of course, cognition in depression. And you've updated the chapter on mood disorders to include information on that.
Yeah, when people neglect that, because people don't think of depression as a cognitive disorder, but it is. Mm-hmm. And it turns out that cognition is a marker for basically bad outcomes. Mm. If you get a single major depressive episode and recover entirely, then you're great. But it turns out that many people recover a lot of their symptoms, and part of the residual is not so much residual mood problems, but cognitive. Yeah. And if you have repeated episodes, that does not get better. And so it's a residual symptom between episodes of depression, particularly in people with chronic depression or multiple episodes of it. And so being able to target that, mostly by trying to get people completely into remission and basically tracking their cognitive symptoms. I even had a funny little cartoon in there. We talk about the cognition being 4 types of disorders, because cognition is not a thing. It's, well, if you ever read a neuropsych report, people listening on here, it's 40 pages and single space. They do all these tests. But the reality is, for us dumb clinicians that are just at the bedside, I said it was the Fab Four. Mm-hmm. Now, you remember the Fab Four. You're a musician. And what was about that? It was the Beatles, right?
That's right.
And so I named each of the cognitive problems after one of the Beatles to help remember it. And so you've got attention, and I thought that was John, because he wanted all the attention. And then you had executive functioning, which is the person that wrote all the songs and was the brains of the place. We'll give that to Paul. Mm-hmm. And then you have memory, which maybe we'll give to George. He's a little guy in the background a bit and just was a culture carrier. But then you had a pace of information processing. Mm-hmm. And that was Ringo on the drums. Boom, ba-da-doom, ba-da-doom, ba-da-doom.
Keeping the tempo, yeah.
Yep. And it turns out that one of the most sensitive things that goes awry in major depression cognition is a pace of information processing. Mm-hmm. And that actually, it can be responsive to good treatment. So what happens to people in depression is they don't really get demented and they can't remember where their car keys are or something. Right. But what they do is it takes a lot more effort to get things done because it's inefficient, it's slow. Mm-hmm. And can you imagine if Ringo was going too slow compared to the other 3 Beatles in the song, what a mess that would be in terms of how it was done. Yeah. And so that seems to what happens to your cognition in depression sometimes, is that the pace of information processing. So you got to treat Ringo. That's what it meant, too.
It's interesting that the cognitive impairment in mood disorders is similar to the cognitive impairment in ADHD, as you said earlier, and especially problems with sustaining attention and working memory, which, of course, cause problems with processing speed. So it's interesting that there's a long history, for instance, of stimulants for depressive disorders. As a matter of fact, I'm going to give you a pop quiz, Steve. You're famous for giving pop quizzes. What is the this is interesting.
Here we go.
Yeah, here we go. What was the first commercially available prescribed antidepressant in America? It was not a
Was it Benzedrine?
It was Benzedrine. 1937, SmithKline French started marketing it like crazy to doctors with the auspices of the AMA, the American Medical Association. So very interesting long history.
I passed. Oh, my God.
I know. Good. That's impressive. You must have heard me say that before. That's
no,
great.
I haven't. I didn't hear. There was no setup here. I did not know that.
That's good. Benzedrine is racemic amphetamine. So very interesting. So cognition, obviously, critically important.
That's what they used to call bennies.
That's right. That's where the name bennies came from. And then the company came out with D-amphetamines, Dexedrine, and they had all these studies saying it was better somehow than Benzedrine, and so that took off. And I like to say we took the D train then instead of the racemic. But our friend Eugene Arnold at Ohio State University actually did studies and showed that the L moiety, the L isomer, actually had significant activity. They just worked a little bit differently, the D and the L.
And as for ADHD, there are what they call mixed salts, or just at least racemic mixtures of D and L. And it looks like L is a little more noradrenergic, balanced with dopamine, whereas the D is more dopamine.
That's exactly right. And I'm fond of saying some patients need some L. They just do. I found that some patients do better on a racemic mixture than a pure D. That's just that kind of the clinical art. Okay, let's shift gears. I'm really curious about something. We talked about nomenclature. And I understand you've redefined the concept of mood stabilizers. Tell me about that.
It's not really me. It's just that nobody knows what it is, including the FDA. If you look, there is no mood stabilizer language in any drug that treats bipolar disorder. So what you really have is 4 options. You can treat from above, anti-manic, and you can stabilize from above, preventing more mania. You can treat from below, treating depression, and you can stabilize into less likely recurrence of depression from below. And so that's actually how they are defined. And again, when we did analysis of the confusion about atypical antipsychotics, the other thing that came up all the time is, how do you use the term mood stabilizer? Is it for mania? Is it for depression? What is it? And so we know what it meant. It came up as an anticonvulsant that works in one of the other phases or the other phases of bipolar disorder. But I think that's gotten really old-fashioned. And what you're really saying is it's a drug that is an anti-manic treatment. And is it anti-manic because it works as lithium does, or it works as a D2 antagonist does, or it works on a voltage-sensitive ion channel like the anticonvulsants do?
Yeah, I always say if you want to really define a mood stabilizer, some of the atypicals are far more mood stabilizers than the traditional mood stabilizers, if you will. Lithium and the anticonvulsants are not terribly good against depression by themselves necessarily. Some of the atypicals, quetiapine, for instance, probably cariprazine, possibly the razidone, really work across the spectrum and are truly mood stabilizers more than the quote mood stabilizer.
Right.
So again, it's like saying antidepressant. It's really antidepressant action that we're talking about.
Exactly. So really, antidepressant shouldn't refer to the drug. It should refer to the action. And so we can have antidepressant action in bipolar disorder.
Okay, we haven't talked about anxiety yet, and one of the things that I've certainly noticed is we've had a real lack of innovation of anxiety treatments, and we haven't had a new drug FDA approved for anxiety in quite a long time. I think it's been 15 years. So what's new in anxiety?
Not much. They've taken OCD and stripped out also PTSD from anxiety disorders, but actually in terms of innovation, not much. And partly the problem is the drugs we have out there work pretty well for all their warts and problems, the incomplete response and the delayed response of SSRIs and the dependence forming, particularly if you use it with drugs of abuse, benzos. It's been very hard to penetrate that. I do know that there's a few things in the pipeline very early, but very early days. And you're right, it's been devoid of innovation these days.
Part of the problem too is trying to do a clinical trial. Anxiety disorders have very high placebo response, and finding a pure anxiety disorder patient is actually very difficult, especially if you're talking about GAD. It's probably so heterogeneous. It's hard to.
This gets back to things. I actually think you should have a concept, particularly with drug treatment, of something I'm going to steal from dementia, where they have dementia-related psychosis. I'm going to call all cause. Anxiety associated with depression is a funny thing, because depression has 65% incidence of concomitant anxiety, and yet it's not a symptom in the DSM of anxiety, of depression. That's crazy. But if you have anxiety with depression, the STAR-D study showed you that you get half the response to your SSRI as you do if you have no anxiety. And then you got the anxiety of GAD, the anxiety of social anxiety, and the anxiety of panic. That's still anxiety. And so maybe the future will be to collapse these, just as I said, into symptoms. You're going to treat, you have to define it. Is it going to be episodic anxiety that is in blasts and panic attacks, or is this going to be anticipatory anxiety? Is it going to be avoidance? Avoidance is actually a form of anxiety. It's a self-imposed treatment. So I think that until we sort that out, it's going to be hard to find a new treatment. There are a couple of GABA-related drugs that are in the pipeline, and there's even one that you inhale that's called a furine. They're out there, but it's early days. And I think it's going to be a problem because you got the placebo response, and you've got the idea. If you treat particularly children or adolescents, and you treat anxiety in children, I say put your seatbelt on every time the patient comes in, because they're going to change their diagnosis. Because kids, particularly with the generalized anxiety, will come in with a few panic attacks, and then they'll have OCD 2 months later, and then they'll go back to being generally anxious.
Yep.
And so same thing with adults that are anxious, and they get depressed and anxious, and then they go back and they have a couple of panic attacks. And so what's that?
I call it the anxiety soup, Steve.
There you go.
It's the soup of different kinds of anxiety, and it does evolve, it morphs. And well, let's face it, these disorders probably are contextually related, environmentally related, time related. They're not static.
Exactly. And that is what we have to do when you're treating real patients. You're treating people with waxing and waning symptoms, and patients demand to have all their symptoms better.
Yeah. Okay, and then let's talk a little bit about dementia. There's been a lot going on in the dementia field, and what are some of the things that you incorporated into this book on dementia?
Controversy. I didn't really have the book written at the time of the controversy came out, which has to do with one of the monoclonal antibodies that all the advisors thought didn't work and shouldn't be approved, but the FDA approved it anyway, to great consternation and resignation of FDA advisory committee members. And actually, it turns out that the field has largely been on strike. Even though this monoclonal antibody has become available, nobody prescribes it. And probably nobody's going to pay for it.
Against amyloid, it's clearing amyloid.
And so an anti-amyloid, it does seem to help your amyloid go down, but it doesn't necessarily mean that because your amyloid goes down that your dementia gets better.
That's right.
That is not very well proven. And so what I did in my book was really just say the amyloid hypothesis is in the intensive care unit right now. Because it may be that getting rid of amyloid is not going to cure Alzheimer's, and it's something else. Right. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, you're going to go from a couple of million people to 15 million people in the United States over the next 50 years with Alzheimer's. It could be you and me as well. So what are we going to do with us old guys when we get it? The answer is we're going to have a lot of behavioral symptoms. And we're going to be alive, but we're going to be hallucinating and have psychosis, and we're going to be agitated. And so the innovations in the field have been to look at symptomatic treatments. Now, of course, that's ultimately self-defeating because it doesn't cure Alzheimer's or whatever, and it goes on to death, of course. But meanwhile, keeping Granny at home does not have to do with the fact that basically balance her checkbook. Granny can stay at home if she can't have memory and so forth, but if she throws her tray on the floor in the middle of the night and wakes up everybody in the house and runs around and wanders and is, combative when you try to help her take a shower, she goes to a nursing home.
That's right.
And treating agitation is very important. And if Granny also is hallucinating and seeing strangers in her room and being upset about that, this prevents quality of life in the person with the dementia and in the families, particularly around them. and the caregivers are really upset by these symptoms. And it's a management problem when they get bad enough and they're in institutions. So it's going to be a godsend to have treatments. And there are, again, the 5-HT2A antagonists, but also the cholinergic drug seems to have great promise to treat psychosis and dementia. And finally, agitation has 2 late-stage drugs to treat agitation in Alzheimer's disease. So I think we're going to have treatments of the behavioral symptoms of dementia far earlier than we're going to have disease-modifying treatments, particularly if the amyloid hypothesis completely blows up.
Yeah, this would be a big deal because obviously now what we do is we use D2 blockers, and we know they've got the black box warning, and there's all kinds of issues from those. The KD study, of course, the KD-AD study showed a lot of problems, higher mortality.
One of the drugs that's going to be likely available is a D2 antagonist. It will have the paradox. It's brexpiprazole.
Yeah.
And it's going to have the paradox of having indication, and yet it says you could die from it. It's a little bit like treating children with SSRIs. 2 drugs have an indication for major depressive disorder, but by the way, it's going to kill you by suicide. So some of this is crazy, if not nonsense. But those of us who have to sort out these paradoxes and quandaries, that's why they pay us the big bucks.
That's right.
Well, I'm sure they do. We have to sort that out and deal with mutually contradictory information sometimes.
Yeah. But the real issue, of course, the real need, as you said, is for disease-modifying agents. And this is where the science has to evolve. We have to learn more about the biology. And there's some really exciting, innovative things happening in the field of Alzheimer's that, as far as really going further upstream and understanding the biology and maybe getting to disease-modifying, there's really nothing in late-stage development there. But that's a huge need, obviously. Well, Steve, we've talked a lot about the field has evolved. Your book has evolved. You've made a lot of changes that should make it really useful. What hasn't changed? What, as far as the bones, the DNA, the spirit of EP, what has not changed?
It's basically the same didactic style, the same visual learning, and the same idea of programmed learning, so that you can go through it in different ways and repeat the material and enjoy it, and then go back to it and refresh your mind very quickly. And that is the main thing that hasn't changed. But half the figures have changed, and all these advances have been put in. The words have changed a lot more than the pictures in a certain way, although there's half new figures. It's the same style and things that people who have looked at the earlier editions will be quite familiar with.
Yeah, it's still, though, the magic that you have is it's eminently readable, it's digestible. Somehow you have an amazing ability, Steve, to take this complicated information and digest it and translate it and present it in a way that's absorbable for a whole range of audiences.
One of the funny things that people told me once, they say, Stahl, I really like your book, but I don't like what you put in it. And I said, what? He says, I like what you leave out of it. And so that's part of the idea of writing more of an essential psychopharmacology. It's not a comprehensive encyclopedic pharmacology. Sure. And so trying to figure out what you don't put in is the way you simplify.
Well, that's what the great blues players say. It's not the notes you play, it's the notes you don't play. That really
I didn't know that. That's cool.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, Steve, I think we've reached the end of our time here. Thanks so much. It's really been fascinating talking with you about the updated version, the new 5th edition of Stahl's Essential Psychopharmacology. And I really hope it's going to be helpful to clinicians out there in the field and to their daily work and treatment of their patients. Any final words?
No, it's just if you're in psychiatry or mental health, you are fortunate. It's going to be a great future. And if you look at the progress we made in the last 8 years, I think there's going to be even more in the next 8.
Sounds great. All right. Thanks so much. Stay tuned for the other podcasts in this series. And we've got 2 more in this little series that we're doing now surrounding the new version of the EP book. And stay tuned for the other podcasts in the Psychopharmacology series. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of the NEI Podcast. Please let us know what you'd like to hear more about by leaving a review. Don't miss another episode. Subscribe today.